Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with Interfex 2017, presents Interfex Live.
Okay, good afternoon. Got another session. We're set. And I'm going to make sure I do the introductions this time because I was informed I forgot. So we have Todd Vaughan, Senior Process Engineer from CRB. And we have Scott Gunther from Catalent. And Alicia, you're with Afton, is that correct? Okay, great. Our discussion is going to be around quality metrics and quality agreements. And I said this to an earlier group. When I used to be in development at Novartis, we never worked without a net. So to me, quality agreements, quality metrics, quality team, if they weren't there, the only time I've worked without them, we got screwed over. So to me, it's a very important topic, okay? So first question. So Todd, what do you think the biggest challenges of negotiating a quality agreement is with a client? Fair question?
It's a fair question. Obviously, when I'm a design engineer on the process side, so our dealing with clients, we may be looking at facilities as well as equipment processes within that facility, and getting them on board early in the process whether it's a build or a retrofit is an important thing to make sure that everybody's aligned on the team, not just the process team or the mechanical team, but also from a quality standpoint, understanding that they're going to help us drive based off of risk assessments that have been done specifically for that project. So it's that early integration of them that I think is one of the biggest challenges to try to get them involved early and keep them throughout the entire process.
That's, I think what we're trying to also get a sense too is quality agreements span build, design build, engineering responses. It involves product development, so that's why we try to get as much of a cross section on this as possible. So Alicia, from a CMO standpoint, Scott, you're next after Alicia. So challenges, what is it?
I would say for us, the biggest challenge is when somebody wants to get nitpicky. We prefer as much as possible to use our own standard agreement so that we are standard in the way that we can conduct our business. And when people get into like the little details and wording, that sort of thing, when really it all means the same thing, we're all doing the same thing. When people get into the language and something doesn't quite align, and really that's not what's I guess important, and it's really the overall thing.
Yeah, Scott?
Yeah, so to add to that, I think some of the quality agreements have been around a long time. They're starting to mature up, what I would say, fairly nicely with regard to expectations. Critical to us in most of our recent events in establishing quality agreements is around frequency and timing, both for the contractor and the contractee, with regard to how paperwork has to go back and forth, especially around deviation management and critical regulatory documents, because we find that the review times for those are usually very clear for the contract giver, and the contract acceptor also needs to make sure that those timelines and those frequencies are in the agreement, because they'll tend to go back and sit or potentially sit, and it's important. The other key factor now in negotiating agreements is from a regulatory body perspective, who actually has the authority to talk to the regulators, and how we're doing that, both from a contractor and from a product holder perspective. The draft guidance makes it clear, a lot more clearer now with regard to responsibilities. Still see product owners or the registration holders wanting to make the final decision to notify agencies. And as a contract manufacturer, we're pushing back a little bit harder these days with regard to our right in an event of an issue to have to actually go back and communicate to an agency, regardless of the product owner's position.
Mm-hmm. Well, my early involvement with quality agreements was, it took and there was never a template, unfortunately, after 17 permutations. But the thing I found was, at least in our case, we were kind of like black box. It was them and the regulators. I think that's the extreme. I think where's it at now, Alicia? I mean, who sits across the table from the guy? Who has to pass the Snicker test? Or as my old boss used to tell me, who goes to jail? So did I make that too complicated? So
Maybe a bit.
yeah, okay. What is it? Do you talk to the regulators, or are the owner completely mute on this, or what? Who files it? You?
Who files?
The dossier?
The client would.
Okay, so in that case, what is your involvement then?
We would be, I guess, reporting issues to the client, and then they would be responsible for reporting to the FD or the regulator.
Okay, and if they have to do an inspection, obviously you guys handle that yourself.
Yeah,
Or is
there
that-
would be notification to the clients
Okay.
if there was an inspection.
Product specific. Yeah, okay. Scott?
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. I think the rub with the registration holders and the contract manufacturers really exists when there are things outside the norm, especially with regard to obligations to report and different opinions, different risk tolerances, different expectations about what's reportable on a field alert. And those opportunities and those times can put a contractor in a critical position, with the registration holder possibly taking more or less risk than they would like. When regulators are asking to see the quality agreements at this point, right? So we certainly share them and discuss them. I think Alicia made a great point. The simpler they can be, the better, so that we don't get tied up in the details. And the other thing is, all around the quality agreements is, I think what you said, is getting involved early and often, and making sure that there's some trust amongst the collaborators to make sure that, regardless of what's on the paper, we're doing what's right for the patient.
So Todd, let me ask you this. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions about a quality agreement?
Well, I think from my experience that we sometimes see kind of a delineation between the group that's running, say, a project and the actual quality group themselves, and it's almost, I wouldn't say it's an adversarial relationship, but there's some refusal to kind of engage with that group sometimes, because you don't want to get turned down on something. You don't want to have to maybe fight that particular battle at that time, and so we see that actually quite frequently. That's a challenge that you have to overcome, that we need to get those quality people involved. That they're part of that team. It's important for them to be on board to help us developing quality attributes for the entire project, process parameters, and so forth.
Alicia?
I would actually say two things, and they're kind of opposites. One of them is that you enact a quality agreement and then you put it in a drawer and you never look at it again. On the opposite side of that, I would say that another misconception is that it's looked at every single day. People pull it out and they review it every single day. And I would say both of those are misconceptions. They are a bit opposite. But at least for us, the quality agreements are a reflection of how we operate. So there's nothing hidden in the quality agreement. We're already doing what we say in there. So it's not something we need to pull out every single day. But it is something that we will review occasionally if it comes to notification requirements, timing, anything like that. It is useful to be able to go back and look at that, but it's not something that gets looked at every single day.
Scott? Yep.
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is the quality agreement or technical agreement is not a binding agreement. And I think that when push comes to shove and contract disputes occur, the quality agreement is a substantial agreement with regard to how the companies interact with each other and who's ultimately responsible. especially when it comes down to product that's marketed and released in the field by a product owner and maybe contracted by somebody else. So for me, that's the biggest misconception. It can be used and will be used in order to support those disputes.
So the agreement is sort of like, having a prenup, huh? It's not really, it's fine until things go strange on you, Gotcha. Okay.
Exactly.
One of the things I found was a dimension that I found lacking in my experience was that there was no working agreement. The day-to-day stuff, who does what, when does it happen? That's the stuff, I think there's the boilerplate, and then there's the day-to-day stuff. Do you delineate any of that? Is there a working agreement, or how does that work, Alicia? I mean, you say, it gets thrown, in an ideal world, you throw it in the drawer and you forget about it, right? In a bad world, you take it out and you go, what am I going to get these guys on? There's got to be some happy medium. So is there a working agreement?
I wouldn't say there's a document to do that. That's more of something that you would see upon an audit. So you get your client to come out and they actually see, your SOPs and your batch records and your day-to-day activities. But I wouldn't say there's a physical document that's in place.
Yeah, for us, I mentioned a little bit earlier, the working agreement really occurs around those critical activities where there's time-bound events. Those are deviation reporting, filing reporting for field alerts, or any of the other global regulatory requirements, anything with regard to change management. And what we're looking for now in our agreements and again, it has to be two ways on both sides. What are the timelines required to ensure that when there's, time-bound events that occur, that you're committed to doing those? It's critical in the equality agreements to put those in. We've had, again, from a regulatory risk perspective, we've had documents open from a change management perspective up to 2 years because the clients have either moved on or not interested, or maybe it's taking that long. But that puts our quality system at risk for having open documentation. And that's where we're looking from an agreement perspective on a working arrangement to make sure that those critical timelines are bound to the agreement.
So what about along those lines? So what are we talking, when we say, what are the expectations for sharing information with CMOs and regulatory? That becomes pretty tough. I mean, if the sponsor's got the filing in and they need, how does that information dissemination happen? Todd, do you have any, you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, I'm not heavily involved on that on that side, so I might defer.
Not just asking. I want to make sure
give it to
you're involved.
Alicia.
For us, we have a very open relationship with our clients. So, barring confidential information from another client, we're very open to share information with our clients.
Okay. Scott?
Yeah, same. It goes back to trust, collaboration, and ultimately, as a CMO, our documents are created with them and for them, so they're their documents. So we're usually very transparent, including in the standard SOPs and practices that we would have that don't interfere with any of the other customers' IP or their documents.
I got you. So Todd, let me ask you this question: is there something other than the quality agreement that you can work with? What has been your experience on that?
Yeah, there's you're not going to have everything in a specific. We've already talked about that in a specific quality agreement. Obviously, there's standardization throughout the industry. There's risk analysis assessments that have been done in order to identify the areas in which we might have the most impact on a product, and obviously then the patient. So obviously as when you're going through a project, specifically on our side, and you're dealing with quality, you have to come to certain specific agreements, obviously. But there are times that you'll come to an event that maybe that has to change, and maybe it wasn't assessed completely at the time, and so you have to be able to be flexible to be able to handle those times of changes, even if it's maybe later in the project. Again, going back to what I said earlier, was getting quality involved early in the process, setting critical quality attributes and process parameters early on allows you to have a more successful project as you go through the project. Once you get to equipment installation, qualification, that part of the process, that needs to be set very early in.
So Alicia, is there other practices that you employ other than the quality agreement to do this?
I would say not necessarily for us to employ, but for the clients to employ. A lot of that comes down to auditing and being on site. You get a very good picture, and for us too, when we're auditing our own suppliers, you get a really good picture of the quality system of the organization that should be reflected in the quality agreement. But when you're actually there, you can actually see it in practice.
Do people usually assign folks to their facility? I mean, I can tell you where we started off thinking it was going to be push the button and we'll watch it happen, and we have 7 people on site all the time. So Scott, from your standpoint, is that something they come down, they move in with you, or?
We like to say no.
Okay.
It's not that, I mean, when you're thinking about quality agreements, there's usually a provision in there on expectations for not only auditing, but man and plant, what we'll call man and plant. And that's, of course, depending on the size of the project, the type of project, the quality history of the site, the amount of trust and credibility you've built is whether or not your customers are going to feel they need to have a man and plant. Obviously, we support it as our customer-friendly approach, and I think most CMOs will support it because that's the business we're in. It's just a matter of, again, making sure that in the quality agreement, the expectations are clearly set. Their access to different services on the site is clearly set. Their ability to move about the site unescorted, given that they're man in plant, woman in plant, is very, very important, because those are where you can tend to see some of that rub happening with regard to when their relationships, if there are any issues with the relationship where people want to start pushing the contractor closer and closer to the exit door, and they're giving them offices that get smaller and smaller and smaller. That's a joke, but it is important to really understand what those expectations will be up front.
Well, let me ask you this question. So, the quality agreement itself, it's gone from we take it out, we put it away, we put it, it's template, so is it just plain old boilerplate, and once it's done, it's done? Is that it? It's a symbol, or is it a tool? Do you use it or not? And if we use it, why or how? Go ahead.
It is used, I would say mostly for notification, responsibilities, who's responsible for notifying who, time frames, that sort of thing. But when you get into, our operation will operate under CGMP.
You would hope, yeah.
It's kind of expected.
Yeah, it's kind of written in there.
Yeah.
Okay. But all right, let me turn it around. Are there financial things that are built into this, Scott? I mean, are there incentives? Alicia, let me finish before you finish.
I would say in our quality agreements, no.
Yeah. There's
That's
no
not
incentives or.
Yeah, so we try to leave anything financial or obligatory from that perspective, from out of the quality agreement. It's a technical agreement relative to the regulations, who's doing what, who's responsible for what, any incentives, any requirements for cost considerations, any issues with regard to financial obligations and limits of liability, all are in the supply agreement.
Supply agreement. Okay, so we do compartmentalize that. That's important. A lot of people get the two confused, I think. Still?
I don't think they're confused. The only thing again, I think we're pretty mature in this process these days, but the customers need to really align on getting the quality agreement signed with or before the supply agreement. Otherwise, it becomes a debate after with regard to what agreements you can really reach. It's much harder to get a quality agreement signed after the supply agreement is signed.
I'll tell you, one of the things I always found incredibly frustrating, if not impossible to deal with, was when we actually put it, because process owners, where I came from, we were Novartis was cradle to grave. Okay, so that meant that if your product, you still had to have input on deviations. So the stuff would come in and had to be acted upon. So there must be like, that must drive you guys nuts. I mean, you're waiting on some guy halfway across the world to get back to you. I mean, how do you manage this sort of stuff?
It can
I
be
was really
frustrating,
bad. I
yes.
was really bad at it, just so you know.
A certain amount of patience and a certain amount of aggressiveness.
Persistence.
Persistence. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah. Okay. Scott?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of, the business we're in, we try to be as customer-centric as we can be. There's a lot of patience, a lot of persistence. The quality agreement really helps establish the expectations. So we talk about going in the drawer, it's a once and done type of thing. Taking the time up front, even if you can get it right up front, will help you avoid a lot of those discussions later. It'll allow us to transition into the operations a lot easier with expectations. So even if it doesn't come out until it's review time, which, maybe more often than not, just having those conversations up front really, really help to establish the relationship from the start.
Yeah, I think in a lot of the way we used to explain it was, we're beyond the dating phase at this stage of the game. So, the understanding was, this is something we got to make work as a family. And sometimes people have a problem with it. So, having said that, like, change control, like, let's start from project changes and stuff like that. So, Todd, I mean, like, how much water goes over the dam before the change control is like, forget about it? What's been your experience?
Yeah.
I'm sure this never happens, right?
Yeah, so that's again, this goes back to we've already stated this before, having a good relationship through the process. You want that input throughout the process, change control coming into place. So, for instance, that we have a designed project. We've gotten to the point where we now are into change control, and the workaround, if we have to make modifications to a process, that's sometimes can be an arduous task, depending on what maybe changes that are taking place. Having that constant feedback with quality, having direct conversations with them with respect to what's expectation and how we need to proceed with it. It can be challenging at times, but I think sometimes we make it a lot harder than what it needs to be, and that goes back again. I've already mentioned it before that those relationships that you have built earlier in the process in order to make those things at the end to go more smoothly.
I think getting back, thanks, Todd. I think one of the things I found was like change control from a product standpoint. We're going to change the raw material supplier. I hated to get those. Okay, I'm going to do. So how do you manage that? I mean, when you're going to, how do you change control, right? So you're going to get an alternate supply. That can be a potential business continuity buster for you guys. How do you deal with this stuff? So what do you do? How do you manage it? There must be some internal management as well on that. So how do you deal with that change control?
Change control is a very wide and broadening subject. It's all about having a good change control program. As a CMO, our change control program needs to be rock solid.
Yeah.
Because we are not notifying every customer every time we have a change. We have to know when that change, our process has to go through that algorithm or decision tree of when or when not a customer needs to be notified. We need to make sure early on in the agreement that they understand our process so that they get comfortable with what they will get and when they will get it, whether it's a facility change that may be direct or indirect impact to their suite, site, equipment, whether it's easier when it's a raw material change or supplier change, because all those things have to go through form of change control. Whereas the CMOs, I put a lot more of my emphasis is that they're notifying us of changes that they may have for us. A lot of times you'll see slippage in the CMC section with regard to how we report at the annual product review, what gets filed, what questions may come back, and what we end up is actually manufacturing from the original batch record that was filed as a registration batch to the commercial product maybe 5 or 6 years later. There's usually a gap somewhere there, what the record used to look like and what it looks like. A lot of that falls on our our customers to give us the changes that they filed, that they've made with the regulatory body, so we're consistent. And then a lot of times we only understand that there's a gap when we're inspected and we find a problem to maybe a registration request or requirement that we're not following.
Who does that? Change control, who monitors that? Who watches the store? Who makes sure they get there?
Every company does it differently, but it all falls back to the change process, right? So whoever is responsible for that change process and those programs that you have at the site, it's got to go both ways. It's got to come from our customer who sends us a change, which goes into our formal change control process. Or if we have a change that we need to initiate, that we get it in so we can know what customers need to be notified and what approvals are necessary.
So how much information do you have on site that allows you to do that? Because when we would go through a change control, we availed ourselves of the early development report, the process transition report, the late process transition report, the validation report, the stability data. Sometimes you need that sort of information. And I'm just wondering, how do you manage that, Alicia? Is that something you're given, or is that something you say, hey, change control, and you let them deal with it?
Well, for us, change control is managed by quality assurance. So I'm a part of that. For us as a smaller company, we would have all that information on site. So it's easily referenced for us. That may not be the case for larger companies who deal with a lot more clients.
Yeah. So again, change control drives the process, and depending on the scope of the project or process, it could be a separate group of people that are working on it to get the collaborative data. There may be other third-party labs involved, which you will have, may or may not have three-way CDAs. You can't even talk to them. So you're working with your host customer to figure out how to get the data that you need in order to make it a change. A lot of times, again, the change is from them. It's easier. They're willing to support you a lot more. If your change is coming internally because you want to move them from one suite to another, they may not have the same level of interest, and that's a negotiation that, we go through all the time. So documents come from, in my mind, they come from wherever they need to come from in order to affect a positive change.
Okay. All right, let's, we talked about the agreements, we talked about the metrics. All right? So my first question is, how should they be reported? Alicia?
For us, our opinion would be to report by product rather than by site.
Right.
That may be different for other API manufacturers, and contract labs may have a different opinion. But for us, it would make the most sense to report by product.
Okay.
And that's in regard to the draft guidance on metrics. So yeah, I think a lot of discussion has been had on this topic with a lot of the industry partners. And CDMOs are kind of in the middle of it all because it depends on what they're looking for from a pure quality management system perspective. So if they're looking for a product-specific perspective, the product customer should report. If they're looking from a quality system perspective at a manufacturing or CMO site, looking at one product may not tell you the whole picture. It also may be dilutive because you may have a poor product and a poor process with a lot of deviations. That if you look overall according to the process, it may not look that bad from a metrics reporting perspective. So I think our firm is in a line, and I think most of the other CMO firms are aligned that looking at the metrics that they're asking for is probably best reported from a product perspective versus a manufacturing supply perspective. The other thing is the burden's going to be if they have to do it and we have to do it. Well, now two people are doing it. How does that data match up? How to make sure we get the right data? And then, of course, we have to pull data twice. So from a contractor perspective, it's an additional burden.
So the guidance is what you're using to collect the information. Is that the way it is? So to be clear, describe the metrics that are described in the draft guidance are how you're collecting the data. Is that correct?
Currently, no.
Okay. Is that the intention? Tell us.
Eventually, if this moves forward, we would monitor what we need to monitor. But the expectation that the FDA has that these metrics are already monitored and gathered in a certain way, I don't think is accurate.
I agree.
Yeah, we agree.
Yeah, the metrics that are specified currently in the guidance or the draft guidance are specifically geared towards the FDA's purpose, which is not necessarily in line with the metrics that manufacturers gather for their purposes.
Yeah, I think specifically too for the complaint metrics as a CDMO, depending on where you sit, it may not be very meaningful because we don't see a lot of the complaints that come through. We'll see the product quality complaints, but we are also part of a supply chain that's we don't do a lot of packaging, so we're only a small piece of that supply chain. We actually may get complaints that are not even relevant to us, but we get them anyway to discount them. Make sure that they're not confirmed, but they may be packaging related versus bulk product related. So the way they're looking at the metrics on the overall product produced may vary from CDMO to CDMO. May actually not be able to compare apples to apples, may not be very meaningful. And I think some of the other metrics there as well, as I talked earlier with the deviation, with the rejects, it may not be meaningful as well. Some companies also may want to look to eliminate products that historically have performed poorly, don't want to invest to retool their product or processes that may be perfectly okay, but could skew a metric because of the type of product or history.
And who do you think should report this then? The sponsor, you?
For us, we would say the sponsor, mostly because like Scott was saying earlier, as far as complaints, not all of them are reported to us. So it may not be a full picture. So it would make more sense for us to report to the sponsor, who would then report to the FDA. And then you're not getting potential double counting, where maybe a packaging complaint is directed towards us, which may not be appropriate, and then it's also reported to the actual packager. It could be counted twice, and then you're not getting an accurate report.
Okay. Well, we're talking about accurate. What do you report as a CMO? What do you collect? I mean, remember, I'm asking you so I understand. So in case somebody else wants to ask the question, you understand my question, right? In other words, what are some of the most meaningful quality metrics that you should be measuring?
Meaningful to us, probably say deviation occurrences.
Okay.
Maybe by product, maybe by process.
I'm good with that. My
My
question is by you or by your sponsor? I'm asking the question to be legit.
It's a valid question.
And again, not trying to put you on the spot, but I think part of it, when we put SUPAC in place, the misconceptions surrounding that were astronomical before it became extremely successful. That's why the dialogue is key. Scott, so what do you think?
Yeah, so I think, listen, the CDMOs have to have a set of quality metrics that are suited for their purpose. If you're a lab, your metrics are going to be different than.
Right.
So, what you said, all the standard metrics are very important. We look at it as a CDMO. We have to look at it on a product by product basis, but we also have to look at our quality system across the site. So what the FDA is asking for may or may not service what we need, and it may or may not service what they need, depending on what lens they're looking for. So our metrics, I would say that they're only asking for 3 in the draft. Our company was part of the ISPE pilot, so we had a lot of experience in pulling the data. Very, very complex, very difficult. Our data set is a little different. Fundamentally, we report the data they're looking for, but we would have to tool it differently to give them exactly what they want. Whether that's easy or not is, probably irrelevant, but the point is, I'm not so sure that they're going to get the exact data from site to site to site that they're actually asking for, because I don't even think it's possible relative to the specificity that they're looking for and how it's reported. Every CDMO has to have metrics today. It's required as part of the ICH requirements and the overall quality management system. How we use it, is very much up to us in terms of making sure that our site systems are properly working, not only the processes and products we manufacture for our clients. It is also a good tool to help us engage with our clients to ensure that going forward, processes that may have been delivered suboptimally because they're looking to register and file before they have I'll call it a full quality by design process, for us to leverage those activities for putting the money to improve at redesign processes that maybe now that they're launched and actually in the market need to have some time and effort spent to actually make them more robust, because we're getting rejects and or reworks or deviations that don't result in product rejects but require a lot of effort. It's very costly.
So it sounds to me like you can use this as a tool to improve quality culture in the company. How do you leverage that? How do you use it? I do a lot of CAPA work, and it's like, well, yeah, great. Did you learn anything? Right? I mean, that's the idea, isn't it? So it don't happen again? So how do you improve the culture? I mean, take a guess if you don't know. Do you do it? I would imagine, right?
So I go the other way, right? Your quality culture is gonna dictate how you deal with your metrics. So you can have all the metrics you want. If you don't do it, and your culture is not supportive of managing those metrics, then you're gonna get what you get.
Right.
You're gonna report them for the sake of reporting them. But it's really around what your management culture is that's gonna allow you to use those metrics to your advantage. I do caution, and have been in environments where the metrics have driven the behavior instead of the metrics has driven poor behavior instead of the metrics driving the right behaviors.
Right.
So we got to be very, very careful of how management views metrics, how they're working with the metrics. Having something in a red category doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It means you need to improve on it. And I'd argue that the right culture wants metrics, and they want to use the metrics in the right way.
Just so you know, I mean, one of the things that we argued with if you remember, at the time, FDA came to ISPE and they said, what is QBD going to look like? All right. And there was 2 or 3 people that said, well, we sat there and, well, we need quality by design. So there's one woman sat there and she says, what was it before? Quality by accident? And the answer is, geez, you're right. So the answer is, you got to look at what you're doing and then leverage that. It's not quality by design, just another way of talking about it. It's the way I tell people, it's the way you gather the way you compartmentalize information. That's the way you do it. So is there a list of guys who are voluntarily involved in this quality metric program, or is there a list of the reporting phase? Should there be a list, or what do you think?
I think that is what the FDA is proposing.
Is that a good idea, or you're allowed to say yes or no?
Maybe, but
very good answer.
I think that there needs to be more clarification on
you think?
how the data is going to be shared, what controls are in place to keep that secure, and then there may be some unintended consequences of that list. People taking those people who are voluntarily reporting, taking those organizations to mean that they are better qualified, and then maybe the ones who didn't report aren't, which may not be accurate at all. There may be some reason that a company didn't report, and it may have nothing to do with how good their quality system is.
I fully agree. I mean, but it sounds to me like somebody's got to lay down some ground rules then. Okay? Thank you very much.